Lucian Freud was a German-born British painter, specializing in figurative art. He is known as one of the 20th century's foremost portrait painters. Freud was an intensely private and guarded man, and his paintings, completed over his 60-year career, are mostly of friends and family. He was famous for mercilessly explicit paintings, notorious for sex with young women in old age, and for his surprising number of children. Some say as many as 40, but in reality, more like 14. His works are not examples of beauty, but they possess a unique ability to hold your attention at first glance. Lucian Freud was born into a wealthy Jewish family in Berlin in December 1922. He was the son of an architect, Ernst Freud, and the grandson of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst. From the outset, his mother encouraged his talent. She hoarded all his childhood drawings. He was her favorite, and she named him after herself, Lucy. In 1933, when Freud was 11 years old, his family moved from Berlin to London to escape the rise of the National Socialists in Germany. They were not refugees, but emigrated voluntarily. Lucian became a British subject in 1939, when he was 17. Freud briefly studied life drawing at the Central School of Art in London. However, he was unhappy with the school's classically oriented curriculum. From 1939 to 1942 he moved with greater success to a school of painting and drawing in Essex, which was more informal, and encouraged individuality. When Freud was 18, he had a sketched self-portrait accepted for publication by the art magazine, Horizon, for which he also drew portraits of its editors, including well-known poet, Stephen Spender. In 1940, Freud rented a studio in London and cultivated a bohemian image, stalking through wartime streets in a fez and fur coat, a bird of prey perched on his wrist. There was a theatrical streak in his personality, and, though it was exaggerated, he gained a reputation at this early age as a snob and a womanizer. Freud's painting, Landscape with Birds, was painted at this time. In 1941, after a brief stint in the Merchant Navy cut short by illness, he returned to painting at his previous art school. His recent wartime experiences resulted in two works, Hospital Ward and The Refugees. In these early works, there is little hint of the physicality and attention to three-dimensional shapes that define his later works. And yet, most of the themes that would come to preoccupy him emerge in these formative years. He concentrated on the faces of people he knew. He made close-up studies of heads, often with downcast eyes. He viewed the lives of animals and plants, and various objects, at close quarters. Between 1942 and 1943, Freud attended Goldsmiths College, part of the University of London, where he studied life drawing with fellow artist John Craxton. The two became close friends, and painted together. Here is an example of both their works at the time. In 1943, when Freud was 21, the publishers of Poetry London commissioned the artist to illustrate a book of poems by Nicholas Moore, entitled The Glass Tower. It was published the following year, and contained, among other drawings, a stuffed zebra and a palm tree. These items reappeared in the painting, The Painter's Room, on display at Freud's first solo exhibition in November 1944. This work has long been regarded as an example of his early experiments with surrealism. But Freud disagreed, saying he was not interested in surrealism. The zebra head was in fact a gift from an admirer, and later lover, Lorna Wishart, and not something from his imagination. It was one of Freud's proudest possessions. During his early career, Freud preferred drawing on paper to painting, as these examples show. He once said that he did 200 drawings to every painting, in his early days. During this period, Freud painted Portrait of a Man, a picture of his friend John Craxton, and also the Portrait of Christian Berard. This is one of the last depictions of the renowned French artist, illustrator and designer, before his death in 1949. 19-year-old Freud started a torrid love affair with socialite Lorna Wishart, a woman 12 years his senior. The affair ended when Lorna found love letters from a young actress in Freud's studio. She became hysterical and dumped him. After getting over the loss of the love of his life, Freud went on to marry Lorna's niece, Kitty Epstein, in 1948. Kathleen Kitty Epstein was the daughter of sculptor Jacob Epstein and socialite Kathleen Garman. Freud painted 5 head and shoulder portraits of Kitty between 1947 and 1948. His emotional involvement with Kitty, at this time, appears to have created a sudden intensification of feelings in his portrait, Girl with Kitten. The evenness of Freud's attention to her stray hairs, hand, eyes and sleeve, and to the kitten itself, creates a self-sustaining tension. At this time, there are also the first indications of a change in style, suggesting that bodies in physical repose might replace the wide-eyed stares of these earlier works. This painting, Sleeping Nude, thought to be of Kitty, is a sensuous study of a sleeping woman, naked to the waist. The painting suggests a great maturing in Freud's ability, and a willingness to render three-dimensional shapes in his paintings, through subtle gradations of tone and color. Notice that he is not yet comfortable with fully nude compositions, or naked portraits, as he liked to call them. His attention to detail, and his increasing interest in the sitter's three-dimensional presence, all helped to produce works of great energy. During this period, heads are cropped so that they fill the frame, odd angles are introduced, and protective barriers between subject and viewer are removed. Freud spent 3 months on this portrait of friend and fellow painter, Francis Bacon, sitting as closely as possible to him during the painting process. In 1952, this was the first of his works to be bought by the Tate Gallery, in London. The portrait, painted oil on copper, generated a great deal of excitement at the time, but, unfortunately has not been seen in public since 1988, when it was stolen from Berlin's National Gallery, and has not yet been recovered. Freud seems most himself in this work. The girl is his wife, Kitty Epstein, and the animal, a bull terrier, the couple were given as a wedding present. The painting was created using a sable brush, applying the paint almost like a drawing. The sitter looks weary. The deep hollows under her eyes, and the self-supporting gesture of the hand under her breast, hint at her discontent, despite this moment of calm. The muted colors, and faint contours of the work, give this composition an overall flatness, typical of Freud's work during this early period. At the time, Freud's relationship with Kitty was beginning to disintegrate. He had painted many portraits of her during their brief marriage, but it all ended in divorce in 1952, due to his chronic infidelities. In the early 50s, Freud rented a studio on the border between working-class Paddington and better-heeled Little Venice in London. He moved easily and steadily between the two worlds, perhaps breakfasting at a workman's cafe, before driving his car to Soho for a day's drinking and betting. A new direction in style came ultimately, through his association with the painter, Francis Bacon, another great English figurative artist, whom he met in 1944. To Freud's reserved manner, Bacon presented as brash, both in art and in life. Inspired by Bacon's example to inject his own painting with a greater vitality, Freud began standing at his easel, rather than sitting. He traded in his fine sable brushes for coarser ones, made of hog's hair, which allowed both greater control and an ability to apply broad strokes in the heavy impasto style he preferred. As a result, his brush strokes became riskier, and the smooth surface of skin, began to show tinges of subsurface energy in his paintings. Bacon and Freud were contemporaries, equals, and in some ways opposites. Bacon was a relatively rapid painter, who often used photographs as a point of reference. Freud, in his own words, could work only very slowly, and never used photography as a source. There was half a generation between them, yet for a long time, they were close allies against the world. When he first sat for a portrait by Bacon in 1951, Freud was intrigued by Bacon's hurried and spontaneous approach. Bacon's paintings of Freud bear little literal resemblance to him and, instead, depict something closer to a psychological sketch, capturing Freud's essence, rather than illustrating his physical reality. Lucian recalled seeing Bacon at some point, virtually every day for a quarter of a century, that is, from the mid-1940s, to roughly 1969, the time when Bacon's work Three Studies of Lucian Freud was painted. This three-part portrait of his friend and colleague was sold in 2013 for $142 million, thus becoming the most expensive work of art ever sold at auction at the time. Freud and Bacon were both notorious and reckless gamblers, preferring roulette and the horses. Lucian once said that in the 1960s, a decade when his work was out of fashion and hard to sell, gambling helped him not to care too much about money. One shrewd bookie, himself a betting man, regularly accepted art in lieu of cash to pay off Freud's debts, and ended up owning 25 paintings, possibly the largest collection of Freud's work in private hands. Much later, in 1983, Freud was warned off the turf, after reneging on debts to bookmakers of some £20,000. There was undoubtedly a dark side to Freud that thrived on quarrels, physical violence and connections to gangsters, such as London's Kray brothers, who helped fund his ruinous gambling habits. Never keen on press attention, Freud gave no interviews for 60 years. He sometimes verbally abused photographers, attacked them physically, or hired gangsters to warn them off. Freud's love of the high life amused some of his friends, and infuriated others who disagreed with what they called Freud's snobbish cultivation of position. Freud won a prize for this painting, commissioned for the Arts Council's exhibition, 60 Paintings for 1951, as part of the Festival of Britain. The painting conveys a sense of the anxiety and want associated with the last years of rationing in the country. A sort of double portrait, it shows Harry Diamond, an EastEnder, who at the time was working as a stage hand. His clenched fist and slightly disheveled appearance perfectly captured the inner torment of a man at odds with his station in life. Diamond was the subject of 4 more paintings by Freud over the next 19 years, until a falling out ended their friendship. The portrait brought Freud the Arts Council prize of £500 at the Festival of Britain, for which he was the youngest artist given a commission. In late 1952, Freud had fallen for high society beauty and Guinness heiress, Lady Caroline Blackwood, daughter of the 4th Marquess of Dufferin and Ava. They married at Chelsea Registry Office, and then eloped to Paris. Freud's infatuation with his new wife fueled his next series of paintings. Caroline's money provided an upper-class lifestyle for the couple. Freud produced this painting, a portrait of his wife Caroline Blackwood from the point of view of someone sharing her bed. The image is very different to the portraits of Kitty that Freud had painted earlier. Kitty's cool pallor has been replaced by golden skin tones, freckles and a reddish nose. It is interesting to note that many portraits Freud painted in the 40s and 50s, in what is now considered his most romantic and gentle style, at the time was seen by many as shocking, violent and cruel because of their extreme attention to detail. Settling for a while in Paris, Freud painted many portraits, including this one, Hotel Bedroom, which features a woman lying in a bed. A man is standing behind her and staring at her. The man is Freud himself, and the woman is Caroline, his wife. The work reflects the anxiety and tension in their relationship, which had already begun to unravel. She would soon divorce him on grounds of mental cruelty and infidelity. When Caroline left him, Freud was devastated. He returned to his old life in London, where friends noticed a change when the divorce came through. People were worried he was going to commit suicide. While having many more relationships, Freud never married again. This painting is among the works that Freud exhibited at the Venice Biennale, when he was invited to serve as the representative of Britain in 1954, a great honor. Most of the best-known works that Freud executed in the next 40 years were of nudes, though his first full-length nude was not painted until 1966. This picture, Naked Girl, illustrates his style. These usually rather vulnerable figures were placed against a white sheet, on an iron bed, or on an old sofa in Freud's studio. The sitter often seemed to be tired, or even asleep, yet Freud's gaze remains tireless, even pitiless, under the glare thrown by an interrogator's 500-watt light bulb. Moreover, there is little independent communication between sitter and onlooker, for the eyes of Freud's subjects rarely meet any beyond the studio. Perhaps inevitably, the intensity of his portraits, and his notoriously long sessions with sitters, have been compared with the psychoanalytic practice of his famous grandfather, Sigmund Freud. Painting on his feet, as Freud was now doing, required extraordinary stamina given his self-imposed work schedule. He would have a morning session with one model, an afternoon break, and then an evening session with another model. 7 days a week, all year round. What's more, these sessions had a tendency to stretch on. Freud took between 6 to 18 months, or longer, to complete a single painting, working into the night if he was in the mood. Freud demanded the sitter's presence, even while working on the background of the portrait. A nude painting completed in 2007 required 16 months of work, with the model posing all but 4 evenings during that time. With each session averaging 5 hours, the painting took approximately 2,400 hours to complete. A rapport with his models was necessary, and while at work, Freud was known as an outstanding raconteur and mimic. Freud's women sitters were often his lovers, or women who would become his lovers. In some cases, they were lovers who became the mothers of his children. He had 2 children with his first wife, Kitty Garman, his daughters Annie and Annabelle. He had none with his second wife, the society beauty Caroline Blackwood. Even before his divorce to Caroline had finalized, he had already carried on procreating, fathering a son, Alexander, in 1957 with Susie Boyd, a student at the Slade School of Fine Art and the subject of this early New Style painting, Woman Smiling. 3 more children with Boyd followed in the next 12 years, Rose, Isabel, and Susie. More or less concurrently, Freud had 4 children with Catherine McAdam, a woman he met in the late 50s when she was a student at St. Martin's Art College in London, where Freud would occasionally sit in on life drawing classes. In the early 60s, Freud had 2 children, Ella and Esther, with his lover, art student, Bernardine Coverley. His painting, Pregnant Girl, captures the topless, 18-year-old Coverley in tender repose, carrying their first child, Bella. Pregnant Girl is regarded as one of Freud's most famous and important paintings, as it was a radical departure from the artist's realist style of the 1950s. Freud had another son, Freddie, born in 1971, with Lady Jacquetta Elliot, Countess of St. Germans. In this picture, large interior W9, she lies nude, in a bed, behind the artist's seated mother, Lucy. Now, what would his grandfather, Sigmund Freud, say about that? Then, with the artist Celia Paul, like Coverley, the subject of a gentle portrait painted while she was expecting, in this case, girl in striped nightshirt, Freud had a son, Frank, who is the youngest of his children, with Annie the eldest. In all, Freud had 14 acknowledged children, with his many wives and lovers. He may, however, have had many more, that go unacknowledged. Freud guarded his privacy jealously. He controlled whether he saw his children or not, and few people had his telephone number. Indeed, for many years, he refused to have a telephone in his studio. Friends and family could contact him with any certainty only by telegram. There were usually plenty of casualties in his wake, not only the discarded lovers, but hurt and offended children, letters left unanswered, or replies of stunning rudeness, debts left unpaid and insults traded. During this time, he did, however, paint all his acknowledged offspring, with the exception of his 4 children by Catherine McAdam, who refused his offers. He painted their faces in family groups, lying in bed with friends, holding their own children, and, most controversially of all, in the case of 6 daughters and 1 son, he painted them naked. He simply did what he wanted, pursuing his art and his own pleasures at whatever the cost. And, somehow, he managed to get away with it. In perhaps his best-known composition of the 1980s, Large Interior W11, after Watteau, Freud replaced the lively flirtation among members of a comic troupe in Watteau's original painting with a group of his own children and friends, seemingly bored and lost in their separate thoughts. It was painted in his Holland Park flat in the early 1980s, and shows his daughter Bella Freud on the mandolin, next to his son Kai Boyt, with Kai's mother Susie Boyt on the right, and Celia Paul on the left. Then there is Star, the child on the floor, who was a stand-in for his granddaughter May. The large canvas with its life-size figures has an extraordinary impact, subdued in color, strong in tone, with vigorous open brushwork, which transform Watteau's fantasy into a scene unmistakably 20th century, yet private and personal. The painting was sold in 1997 for £3.75 million, a record for a living British artist, although the money went not to Freud, but to his former dealer, James Kirkman, with whom he had fallen out. This is one of the earliest examples of what would become Freud's mature style. The subject matter is conventional, but the pose unusual. The subject is Tim Behrens, a friend and student at Slade's School of Art, where Freud was a visiting teacher. The work's generic title gives no hint to the specifics of the sitter, or the setting, and reflects the consistent, clinical detachment with which Freud approached all his subjects, no matter what their relationship to him. The pose this sitter is holding is wildly uncomfortable, and illustrates Freud's general approach to the human form. In particular, his ability to suspend empathy with the sitter, in order to observe him or her more closely. It is also one of the first examples of the appearance of rags, strewn about in loose piles, a common compositional device in Freud's later portraits. Naked Child Laughing was Freud's first, full-length nude picture. The sitter was his daughter Annie. Lucian asked his eldest daughter, aged 14, to remove all her clothes and teenage inhibitions for a nude portrait. It was certainly risque to use a somewhat innocent and naive teenager as a naked model. This was a momentous and controversial event in Annie's life. Many felt it was reprehensible, if not downright immoral. Lucian didn't care. The question of whether it would damage his daughter simply did not occur to him. On a worn sofa in his studio in Paddington, Annie is perched with her leg jackknifed into a position of protective modesty. In this picture she displays hints of emerging sexuality, combined with a gleeful innocence. It is a study in vulnerability and teenage allure, with her wild grin of spontaneous mirth. This is good subject for any artist, but one with a psychological edge. It questions the line between appropriate and inappropriate behavior by a father toward his pubescent daughter. Lucian's father died in 1970, and soon after, his mother Lucy fell into a deep depression and unsuccessfully attempted suicide. According to Lucian, his mother never fully recovered from the suicidal depression, and for the rest of her life, she convinced herself that she was perpetually and seriously ill. From the time he was a small boy, Freud had felt his mother to be an unbearably intrusive presence, the stereotypical overbearing Jewish mother. She used to be a very aggressive woman, he said. She was like that all her life. He didn't want to see her, and didn't like being with her. Freud said that if his father had not died, he'd never have painted his mother. For the next 15 years, Lucy sat for a series of portraits for the artist. The first were completed in 1972. One of these, the painter's mother too, zooms in on Lucy's fierce, earnest face, her brow pinched, her lips pursed tightly. As might be expected, the earnestness on display is not hopeful and energetic, but weary, embattled, even doomed. Another painting in the series extends these feelings still further, the painter's mother resting 3. These extraordinary paintings record his mother's deterioration with an unflinching, near-forensic concentration that has been condemned by some as callous, even cruel. The last work in the series was drawn by Freud the day after his mother died in 1989. One of the late 20th century's most celebrated portraitists, Freud painted only those closest to him, friends and family, wives and mistresses, and, last but not least, himself. His insightful series of self-portraits spanned 6 decades. He painted himself obsessively. While these works may lack the range of Rembrandt, Van Gogh, or Schiele, Freud's self-portraits form one of the most complete visual autobiographies of any 20th century painter. They give us some insight into the self-absorption and relentless drive that fueled the artist. This painting, Reflection, is among the most famous. Painted in 1985, when the artist was 63 years old. In contrast to the explicit nudity of his other portraits, here nudity is implied. Whereas other sitters look ungainly and awkward in their portraits, the level of self-possession in Freud's pose here is typical of Freud's other self-portraits. He squares his shoulders and looks directly out as if to challenge the viewer. While unsparing in his inclusion of folds, wrinkles and other signs of aging, the face he describes is classically handsome, with an aquiline nose, strong jaw and expressive brows. Freud was good-looking and proud of it. It is perhaps telling that the only individual Freud couldn't manage to make look ugly in his paintings was himself. This full-length portrait of Freud's naked body, painter working, Reflection, was painted when he was 71 years old. Throughout his life, Freud refused to use the word nude and thumbed his nose at art history by painting his subjects naked, with all that word's connotations of exposure. For this self-portrait, Freud adopts a gladiatorial pose, his brush held like a broadsword, as though in combat with himself, though the plain background and lack of perspective make him seem unbalanced in his unlaced slippers. Exposed to us is a sinewy body, imposter with thick strokes of grey, white and brown paint, head thrust forward, and eyes fixed on the self, both internal and external. Not even the aged Rembrandt subjected himself to such visceral self-scrutiny. It was around this time that David Dawson came into Freud's life. Dawson, a struggling artist, started taking on menial tasks for Freud in 1990, when Freud was 68 years old. They liked each other's company, and worked together for the next 20 years. Dawson made sure that all Freud had to worry about was painting. During this period, Dawson recorded Freud's life through his photography. He also became one of Freud's most frequently used sitters. In 1992, Freud sought out the services of New York art dealer William Acquavella, who began to take care of Freud's commercial dealings. The artist alerted his new dealer to the small matter of some gambling debts he had accrued. Acquavella met with Freud's bookie, who told him that the painter owed him $4.6 million. Acquavella not only settled the debt, but started selling Freud's new paintings at 6- and 7-figure prices, making the artist, for the first time in his life, a rich man. Freud painted many works of the Australian performance artist, Lee Bowery. Freud's friends introduced them, hoping that Bowery's flamboyant style, which included bright colors and sequins, would inspire Freud to abandon his usual drab palette. Freud saw Bowery's muscular legs as his best feature, and often showcased them. He produced a series of unusually unself-conscious and passive poses that thwart the conventions of male portraiture. For this painting, Freud painted Bowery lying naked on a bed with Nicola Bateman, who worked with Bowery, and married him not long before his death. The work is a theatrical composition rendered in a hushed palette that heightens the scene. It's a one-act tour de force. Freud claimed the work had drama. "Without drama it doesn't work," he said, "it's just paint out of a tube." Freud continued to paint Bowery over the course of 4 years, until the actor died of an AIDS-related illness. Freud paid for his body to be sent back to Australia, as Bowery had wished. From the mid-1990s, over a 3-year period, Freud painted a series of huge nude portraits, depicting the very large Sue Tilley, or Big Sue as she was called. She was a local government worker from London, and one of the artist's most celebrated sitters. This series of paintings used her job title, Benefits Supervisor, in their name. Many found the works to be highly disturbing, because of Freud's unconventional choice of model and poses. This work is an oil-on-canvas painting, depicting an obese naked woman, lying on a couch. At this time, Big Sue weighed about 127 kilograms. Tilley was first introduced to Freud by Lee Bowery in 1990, but didn't pose for him until a year later, when he created 3 pictures of her. The painting, Benefits Supervisor Sleeping, was sold by Christie's in New York in 2008 for $33.6 million, the highest price ever at the time, for a work by a living artist. This work is regarded as one of the most remarkable paintings of the human figure ever produced. This extraordinary portrait demonstrates Freud's mastery of the painterly medium, as he records the subtle nuances of Tilley's ample figure, with astute dexterity. Painted during a 9-month period in 1994, this remarkably candid portrait is a stunning essay on Freud's patient, painterly practice, in which he undertakes an exhaustive examination of the human form, and renders every curve, fold, blemish and contour of Tilley's body with a disquieting and deeply evocative force. Benefits Supervisor Resting, sold at Christie's New York auction in 2015 for $56.2 million. These paintings have become some of the most celebrated in Freud's oeuvre, and were selected for the 2012 critically acclaimed retrospective of the artist's portraits, organized by London's National Portrait Gallery, after Freud's death. Freud painted many portraits of famous people throughout his career. He famously refused to paint people he disliked, turning down Pope John Paul II, and Princess Diana. Queen Elizabeth is perhaps his most powerful, and globally recognizable subject. Freud wasn't commissioned to paint the Queen, but approached aides to see if she would be willing to sit. While Freud normally created large paintings, this composition measures approximately 24 by 15 centimeters, making it one of his smallest works. Nonetheless, it depicts the British monarch as an imposing presence. The small canvas took over 6 months to complete, and was finally finished in December of 2001. By the time he was ready to paint the crown, the Queen, who had other obligations, had run out of time. So, a model had to be used. The project sparked fierce debate, and got mixed reviews, yet in his forthright observation of the Queen's features, one sees the raw intensity Freud had maintained throughout his career, and refused to minimize, regardless of his subject. Freud donated the portrait to the Royal Collection. Freud's painting, After Cézanne, is based on this painting by Paul Cézanne, Afternoon in Naples. Freud reworked Cézanne's light-hearted Italian romp into a gritty shambles on the floor of an unkempt studio. Freud shows Freddy, one of his sons, turned away from a woman who would confront or console him. Freud later added a piece of canvas to accommodate the whole of another woman bringing in tea, to go with the sympathy. The painting, notable because of its unusual shape, was purchased by the National Gallery of Australia for $7.4 million in 2001. Freud, who was renowned for his unflinching observations of anatomy and psychology, made even the beautiful people look ugly, even Kate Moss. The 38-year-old model befriended Freud in 2002. Freud was introduced to her after she named him on a TV show as a person she would most like to meet. After going for dinner with him, he began painting her in the nude when she was pregnant with her daughter, Leela Grace. The painting took 9 months to complete. The model sat from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m., 7 nights a week. The finished painting was later sold to an anonymous bidder at auction for £3.9 million. Painted in 2003, a portrait of Andrew Parker Bowles, ex-husband of Camilla, Britain's Duchess of Cornwall, sold for $35 million in New York in 2015. The artist created it in 2004, shortly before Camilla married Charles, then the Prince of Wales. Freud was 81 years old at the time. The 2.15-meter-tall portrait of Parker Bowles, the Brigadier, was painted after 18 months of sittings. Freud dispensed with his usual exposed flesh to do a traditional-style painting of a distinguished British gentleman in uniform, although with a characteristically earthy Freudian twist. With his red striped trousers, Parker Bowles evokes glamorous 19th-century images of officers and imperial heroes, but he looks exhausted, saddened, wiped out. The painting is magnificent, melancholy, and funny at the same time, a military man, resplendent in his beribboned coat, with a gold braid collar, and his smart, dark trousers, with wide red stripes down the side. His face is lost in thought, and his midsection asserts itself as the picture's focal point. Lucian Freud died in July 2011. He was 89 years old. He is buried in Highgate Cemetery. Archbishop Rowan Williams officiated at the private funeral. His final portrait is of a naked man, his assistant David Dawson, and a dog. Portrait of the Hound is unfinished, but otherwise betrays no sign of the age of its creator. Freud spent much of his career being deeply unfashionable. For several decades, until his death, he stuck stubbornly to his program of stark, severe portraiture, ignoring the many trends that washed over the art world in that time. While so many of his fellow artists were dashing between happenings and video installations, Freud stood in his studio, squinting and scowling at splayed naked bodies, piling his canvases with sagging jowls, curled toes, and pubic hair. One of Freud's great contributions to the whole idea of portraiture was to shift away from the presumption of knowing, of illustrating personality traits, or penetrating the character of the sitter. In his paintings, nothing ever stands in for anything, nobody represents anything, and everything is a portrait, even if it's a chair. An artist, Freud said, should appear in his work, no more than God in nature. The man is nothing, the work is everything. Art is not to make us laugh or cry, or to arouse our lust or our anger, but to do as nature does, that is, to fill us with wonderment. On his death the artist left behind a will, which after legacies and taxes, left the remaining £42 million to be held in trust for others, who were not to be named. His assistant, David Dawson, inherited Freud's house in Kensington, as well as £2.5 million. Freud's children, seldomly visited.